Content warning. The story, characters, and events in this book are entirely fictional. Any similarities to actual people, places, and events are purely coincidental. This story contains heavy violence, strong language, and sexual themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Chapter 5. Nothing Stronger Than Our Love. Morning light filtered through the bay window, the warm glow of the sun casting intricate patterns over the spread of food on the table. In a world where neon lights often outshone the sun, this moment of natural warmth was a rarity. The dishes laid out, a tableau of rice crowned with glistening beans, a poached egg, scrambled eggs flecked with tender chicken, cold tofu dressed in scallions, and 4 steaming bowls of onion soup were like offerings to a god long forgotten. Winifred, Apricot's mother, moved like a ghost through the kitchen, her presence so rare that it felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. Her mornings at home were stolen moments from a time before, a world that now only existed in memories and dreams. Apricot inhaled deeply, letting the savory aroma mingle with the subtle, lingering scent of her mother's perfume, grounding her in this fleeting, fragile reality. The silence was shattered by Jasper's voice, the words heavy with an unease that had been gnawing at him for days. "I'm worried about my test," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly would make his fears real. The tension in the room crackled, the air thick with unspoken anxieties that buzzed like static. Apricot forced a smirk, tilting her head just enough to let her teasing words slide out smoothly. "Have you really been studying?" she asked, her tone light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that hinted at the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Jasper's chopsticks froze mid-air as he shot her a glance, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "You've seen me with my textbooks. I'm practically drowning in them," he retorted, the defensive tone of his voice betraying his growing frustration. "Jasper!" Winifred's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The sound was sharp, final. Jasper's posture wilted, his shoulders sagging as he lowered his chopsticks, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. "I was just saying," Jasper mumbled, the defiance that had been simmering within him now reduced to a flicker, barely visible. "If you've been studying, you'll do fine," Apricot said softly, her voice a blend of reassurance and command as she leaned in to wrap her arms around him. The gesture was gentle, comforting, yet there was an underlying possessiveness in the way she held him, as if she was trying to anchor him to this moment, to this reality. Jasper prodded at his food, his eyes focused anywhere but on her. Their father's voice broke the uneasy silence, laced with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What subject is giving you trouble?" "History," Jasper muttered, the words spilling out like something bitter. "It's all a mess. Names, dates, battles. It's just a jumble of dead people and wars that don't matter anymore. Who cares about the feudal wars? They're dust now," he finished, his voice trailing off into a discontented murmur. I didn't care much for history at your age either," their father remarked, his tone almost too casual, as if he were trying to sweep away the dark cloud that was slowly engulfing the room. The conversation shifted abruptly, the way it often did in their household. Winifred's voice, light yet distant, broke in. "Apricot, can you watch the house for a couple of nights?" Her question was casual, but there was a coldness in her eyes, a detachment that made it seem as if she was already gone. Apricot hesitated, a dull ache blooming in her chest, but she forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, it's not a problem," she replied, the lie leaving a bitter taste on her tongue. "Another long trip?" "Yes," Winifred replied, her gaze drifting past the walls, as if she could already see the places she would soon be. "We're circling the globe with a stop in Castor. It'll be nice to be home again, even for just a few days," she added, her voice warm, but tinged with a sense of longing that Apricot couldn't quite place. Her father raised an eyebrow, his tone a mix of surprise and something deeper. "All the way to Castor?" he asked. Apricot felt a sharp pang of jealousy twist in her gut. Castor, a place of peace, of nature, of belonging. Everything this city wasn't. Here, everything felt synthetic, controlled, suffocating. But her father wasn't done. "I've got some interesting news myself," he said, a flicker of excitement dancing in his eyes as he tried to shift the focus back to him. Jasper's eyes brightened with a rare spark of interest. "What kind of project?" he asked, leaning forward, his earlier frustration momentarily forgotten. "I'll be designing an atmospheric elevator for the Eukelian Space Department," their father announced, his words coming in a rush. "We'll suspend a hydraulic rail system to reach the space station for supply shipments." As he spoke, Apricot watched Jasper's eyes widen, his lips forming a silent wow. The technical jargon flew over her head, but she couldn't help smiling at Jasper's reaction. His fascination with technology was a sharp contrast to her own leanings, which were more abstract, more human. As she processed this, a thought stirred within her. Maybe she was more like her mother than she had realized. The idea of soaring through the skies, navigating between cities like her mother did, held a certain allure. There was a sense of freedom in it, a sense of purpose that journalism had never fully given her. Before she could dwell on the thought, Miss Signa, their housekeeper, interrupted. "Oh, Apricot, you received a message from Fukugata. They want to do a broadcast interview about your story." The mention of Fukugata jolted Apricot, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't forgotten about the interview, but she had buried it under a mountain of other thoughts. The chopsticks slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate. "Yeah, quite a few people have read that story," her father chimed in, his tone dismissive, as if unaware of the weight those words carried for her. Apricot blushed, a mix of pride and unease coloring her cheeks. She hadn't anticipated her story gaining this much traction, and now that it had, the reality of it was almost too much to process. Ms. Signa's expression remained unreadable as she added, "I hope you don't do anything so reckless again." Apricot shook her head, trying to wrap her mind around the situation. "Fukugata?" she repeated, her voice catching slightly. Fukugata was no small deal. It was the primary news network in Blue Ash, and its reach extended across most of Okabe. This was a big break, one that Apricot hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. Her thoughts raced, a mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling in her chest. Before she could fully process the news, Jasper's voice broke through again, this time tinged with something akin to fear. "Whoa, guys, look," he said, pointing to the television. The screen displayed an emergency broadcast, the ticker at the bottom revealing the grim news. "Ro Okabe commits suicide by jumping from the roof of the Rinjio Shrine." Apricot's breath hitched as the finality of the words hit her like a physical blow. "And there goes a legacy," she muttered under her breath, the weight of the loss settling heavily on her heart. The subway rattled along its tracks, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the otherwise empty car with a low, almost ominous hum. Apricot scanned the sparse passengers, her gaze landing on a man sprawled across the back bench, his limbs splayed out as if he owned the space. The defiance in his posture was palpable, a silent challenge to anyone who dared approach. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows, warping his figure into something almost monstrous. Gripping the overhead rail, Apricot moved toward him, her steps deliberate, cautious. The man lifted his head, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "Ah, damn," he muttered, his voice rough and gravelly, as though he hadn't spoken in days. He pushed himself upright with a grunt, one hand rubbing at his temples. "What do you want, reporter girl?" Apricot hesitated, her mind racing to place his face. He was familiar. a ghost of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "Do you still have that camera you were trying to sell?" she asked, her voice steady, though a cold unease prickled at the back of her neck. The man's lips curled into a bitter smile, a hollow laugh escaping him. "Ha!" He slumped back against the bench, his gaze drifting to the ceiling, as if searching for answers in the cracked paint. "Don't suppose you want to buy it now?" Apricot forced a smile of her own, though it felt like a mask. "Actually, I do." "Listen, girl," the man fumed, his voice rising as he lowered his head to meet her gaze. "You should have bought it the other day. I already sold the damn thing." "Oh," Apricot groaned, disappointment washing over her like a cold wave. "That's a shame. I really needed it." "Yeah, well, too bad I don't have it anymore." The man's words were sharp, dismissive, but as Apricot turned to leave, a shiver ran down her spine. The next moment, his hand clamped around her wrist, his grip like iron. She turned back, her breath catching as she saw the wild gleam in his eyes. He shoved something into her arms, pressing it hard against her chest. "I don't need your pity," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Apricot looked down, her heart racing, as she realized what he had given her. "The camera?" she whispered, confusion clouding her thoughts. "I know what you're doing," the man snapped, his glare piercing. "Poor Cortez needs help because the mean men beat him up," he sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, I don't want your charity. Just stay the hell away from me, got it?" Apricot stammered, holding the camera out for him to take back, but he only glared at it with disgust. "Keep the damn thing," Cortez spat, his expression twisted with anger. He turned away, his steps heavy as he exited the car, leaving Apricot standing there, the camera clutched in her trembling hands. The subway rattled on, its mechanical hum filling the void left by his departure. Despite the tension, Apricot felt a strange sense of relief. She could finally repay Sato. The city loomed over her like a dark monolith, the buildings stretching endlessly into the sky, their windows like hundreds of eyes watching her every move. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Apricot walked with her headphones snug over her ears, the music a thin barrier against the oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. Her uniform, a tight red button-up shirt, a yellow apron and matching shorts, felt garish and out of place against the muted tones of the shadowed streets. "Nothing is stronger than our love," she sang softly, her voice trembling as she tried to inject a sense of normalcy into the situation. "Troubles that surround me all go away when you are here." She forced a slight bounce into her step, though her heart wasn't in it. "When you need me, baby, nothing keeps me away," she continued, her hips swaying mechanically to the beat. "Oh, ah," she added, but the sound felt hollow, like an echo in a dead world. A chill slithered down her spine, the air around her growing colder with every step. She raised a hand to her lips, exhaling slowly, watching as the warm breath puffed into the cold air and dissipated. "That's strange," Apricot muttered, glancing back to see that the streetlights had gone out one by one, leaving the road behind her in complete darkness. A deep sense of unease curled in her stomach, tightening with every passing moment. "Nothing stronger than our love. Nothing stronger than our love. Nothing stronger than our love," she repeated, her voice growing more frantic as she fumbled with her music player. The screen flickered, the song rewinding and repeating itself in a stuttering loop, the malfunction only adding to the dread gnawing at her. With a frustrated tug, she yanked the headphones out, the sudden silence pressing in on her like a weight. Apricot stared at the flickering screen, a sinking feeling settling in her gut. She shoved the player back into her apron and quickened her pace, as if she could outrun the fear creeping up her spine. The streetlights ahead of her began to flicker ominously, One by one, the bulbs popped, their light bursting and plunging the street into an even deeper darkness. Her walk turned into a run, adrenaline flooding her veins as panic took over. After 3 blocks, her legs gave out, and she bent over, gasping for breath, her hands clutching her knees. The lights behind her flickered back to life, but the ones ahead continued their erratic strobe, casting disorienting shadows that danced across the pavement. "It's just a power outage," Apricot whispered to herself, trying to steady her breath, though her voice wavered. "It's got to be something like that." She looked around, hoping no one had seen her panic. The street was deserted, the emptiness amplifying her sense of vulnerability. After one last glance over her shoulder, she forced herself to keep moving, her senses on high alert. Placing products on shelves had always felt like a monotonous chore to Apricot, a repetitive task that made time drag endlessly. The colorful boxes with their cartoon images mocked her, their bright designs a stark contrast to the dim reality she found herself in. Each box she placed felt like a weight, dragging her further into a state of mindless routine. The neon lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sickly, artificial glow over everything. As she stepped back to inspect her work, ensuring the boxes were neatly aligned, she noticed a man standing a little too close. His eyes were locked on the display, but something about the way he held himself made her uneasy. He was mumbling under his breath, the words too low for her to catch. Apricot grabbed another box, trying to ignore the growing tension in her gut, and continued working, hoping the man would move along. But instead, his mumbling grew louder, more insistent. "Why are you looking at me?" he hissed, his voice sharp and accusing. Apricot's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slightly, catching his gaze out of the corner of her eye, but quickly decided it was better to ignore him. Maybe he'd just go away. She reached for another box, her movements slow and deliberate, but the man's head snapped toward her, his eyes burning with a strange intensity. "Why are you staring at me?" he shouted, his voice echoing down the empty aisle. Apricot jumped, her hand flying to her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't looking at you." "Is there anything I can help you with?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Stop looking at me," the man yelled, his voice rising in pitch. Apricot averted her gaze, clutching the cereal box as if it were a lifeline. The man continued to glare at her, a low growl rumbling from his throat. She glanced back, only to be met with a feral snarl. "Don't look at me," he spat, his words laced with venom. Apricot took several steps back, the distance doing little to ease the fear tightening in her chest. "Why are you looking at me?" the man screamed, his voice cracking as he doubled over, gagging loudly. A thick, dark fluid spilled from his mouth, splattering onto the floor. Apricot froze, her mind racing. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her body refusing to move. "Don't look at me," the man howled, his voice distorted as if coming from somewhere deep within. Long fingers clawed at the sides of his mouth, and Apricot's stomach churned as she watched in horror. The fingers pulled, unhinging his jaw with a sickening crack. His face ripped open, blood pouring from the gaping wound as muscles and tendons snapped like overstretched rubber bands. He continued to gag, his throat splitting open like a grotesque flower. From the torn flesh, a mass of tumorous growth emerged, its surface glistening with mucus. In the middle of the wad, a sideways mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth and a long, snake-like tongue. The man's fingers pulled further, revealing a grotesque, slimy creature writhing within the ruined shell of his body. Apricot's scream tore through the store, her legs carrying her backward as the creature clawed its way out of the pulpy mess. At the end of the aisle, other shoppers gathered, their faces pale with terror as they watched the abomination struggle to free itself. The creature was stuck, its movements frantic, desperate. With a guttural groan and a bloody burst, it ripped the man's body in half, exposing its full, hideous form. Clutched in each of its hands was half of the mangled corpse. The abomination regarded the soggy flesh in its grasp before shifting its gaze to Apricot. It hurled the remnants at her with a snarl, the slab of meat hitting her with enough force to knock her to the ground, splattering her in gore. Apricot shrieked, her hands clawing at the remains, trying to tear them off her skin. She kicked her feet, pushing herself away from the pile of flesh, her body twisting in a desperate attempt to escape the creature. She scrambled to her feet, only to slip on the blood-soaked floor, her body hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through her, but fear numbed it, her survival instinct overriding everything else. She turned her head just in time to see a man smashing a glass bottle over the creature's head. Shards of glass embedded themselves in the abomination's flesh, glinting like jagged teeth. The creature turned on the man, its movement fluid and eerily graceful. In one swift motion, it grabbed his head with its grotesque fingers. His scream echoed in Apricot's ears as the creature ripped his head from his shoulders with sickening ease, like a child plucking a flower from its stem. "Holy shit!" Apricot screamed, her voice hoarse, as she forced herself to her feet and ran, her terror propelling her forward. She rounded the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted past the aisles toward the produce section, where the warehouse loomed like a sanctuary. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, the harsh glare turning everything into a sharp-edged nightmare. Her heart pounded in her chest, a relentless drumbeat that matched the terror driving her forward. The shelves toppled like dominoes behind her, the creature vaulting over them with a predatory grace that sent a jolt of fear straight to her core. Its eyes, gleaming with a sick hunger, were locked on her, unwavering. Apricot's mind raced as she navigated the labyrinth of produce carts, her body moving on pure instinct. The cold metal of a shopping cart grazed her hip, the pain sharp but insignificant, compared to the fear clawing at her throat. A young boy stood frozen in the middle of the produce section, his wide eyes reflecting the monstrous shadow bearing down on them both. Apricot's breath hitched, her heart twisting as she reached out and grabbed the boy, pulling him into her arms. "Come with me," she shouted, her voice edged with a desperation that she couldn't hide. The boy stumbled, his small feet struggling to keep up with her pace, but his grip on her hand was iron, as if he knew she was his only hope. They burst through the door into the warehouse, the heavy metal panel slamming shut behind them with a resounding clang that echoed through the cavernous space. The warehouse was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows over the industrial shelves that loomed like silent sentinels. Apricot scanned the room, her eyes falling on a group of people huddled together at the far end, their faces pale and etched with fear. The warehouse walls might keep out the creature, but the terror that had taken root in their hearts was another matter entirely. "What the hell is that thing?" one of her co-workers shouted, his voice cracking as he backed away from the entrance, his eyes wide with disbelief. The others looked around, their gazes flickering between the door and each other, as if expecting the monster to burst through at any moment. Apricot held the boy close, her heart still pounding in her chest. She stroked his hair, her hand trembling as she tried to offer him some comfort. "It's okay," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. A lie meant more for herself than for him. But the boy's eyes were locked on the door, his small body shaking with fear. "Is it coming?" he asked, his voice a frightened whimper. Apricot swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No," she lied again. "It's gone." A voice cold and insistent echoed in her mind, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "You can save them, Apricot. Use the powers I've given you." Apricot stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was unmistakable, the Reaper, the entity that had haunted her for so long, now more present than ever. It was a reminder of the dark power that pulsed through her veins, a power she had tried to ignore but could no longer deny. She stared at the warehouse entrance, her mind spinning as she struggled to reconcile the fear she felt with the command ringing in her ears. The screams and cries of the others only heightened the turmoil within her, their panic feeding into her own. Apricot knew what she had to do, but the weight of it threatened to crush her. She let go of the boy, her hands clenching into fists as a fire began to build inside her, a heat that both terrified and exhilarated her. The creature burst through the entrance, its parasitic mouth open wide, claws gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It charged at Apricot, its movements wild and relentless, like a beast driven by a hunger that could never be sated. Just as it was about to reach her, a metal pole shot forward, impaling the creature's chest. The monster let out a wet, gurgling scream, its body convulsing as it tried to wrench itself free. Apricot blinked, her senses sharpening as she realized one of her co-workers had stepped forward, his face contorted with effort as he held the creature in place. "Get back!" he yelled, his voice strained with the exertion of holding the pole steady. The creature's tongue whipped out, wrapping around the man's neck like a serpent, tightening with a deadly intent. Apricot gasped, her eyes widening in horror as the butcher, armed with a large knife, rushed past her. With a single, powerful stroke, he severed the tongue, freeing the man, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The creature turned its head toward the butcher, its eyes blazing with fury. It roared, the sound a guttural, otherworldly noise that reverberated through the warehouse. But the metal pole was driven deeper into its chest as the co-worker twisted it with all his strength, letting out a primal roar of defiance. The creature's claws lashed out wildly, narrowly missing the man's face, but he held his ground, his grip unwavering. Apricot felt the heat within her rising, the power she had been denying for so long now impossible to ignore. Her blood boiled, her vision tinged with red as the Reaper's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to act. "Fight, Apricot. You have the power. Use it." Out of the corner of her eye, Apricot noticed a flash of light at the warehouse entrance. She turned just in time to see 2 police officers burst in, their guns raised and ready. The sharp crack of gunfire filled the air as they unloaded round after round into the creature's back. Each shot sent bright flashes of light tearing through its flesh, the bullets burrowing deep and ripping it apart from the inside. The creature let out a final, agonized screech before it began to disintegrate, its body fizzling out like embers caught in a gust of wind. The metal pole clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, eerie silence that followed, as if the creature had never existed. Apricot stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. The boy, still trembling, tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I don't like your friend very much," he whispered, his small voice filled with a childish honesty that cut through the lingering tension. Apricot turned to respond, but the boy was already backing away, his eyes wide with fear as he slipped through the fire escape at the back of the warehouse. For a moment, Apricot could only watch him go, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her thoughts a jumbled mess of relief and confusion. "Everyone stay calm," one of the police officers commanded, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "We need everyone to cooperate so we can get you out safely. You've been exposed to a hallucinogenic agent. Please come with us, and we'll administer an antidote." Apricot's head snapped toward the group of officials in white hazmat suits now entering the warehouse, their faces hidden behind reflective masks. The sterile, clinical appearance of the suits was jarring, a stark contrast to the raw terror that had just unfolded. A cold dread crept up her spine as she realized how surreal it all seemed, like a scene from a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That wasn't a hallucination. It really happened, Apricot whispered to herself, her voice trembling with the truth she knew deep down. But as she looked around at the others, some dazed, some still in shock, she could see the seeds of doubt taking root in their minds. The official story would be accepted because it was easier to swallow than the terrifying reality. In the shadows at the edge of the warehouse, Apricot caught sight of a figure watching her. The Reaper. Its presence was a silent, chilling reminder of the power she had been granted, and the responsibilities that came with them. "You have become a shameful disappointment," the Reaper's voice echoed in her mind, its tone cold and cutting. The words struck her like a physical blow, leaving her feeling hollow, uncertain. The weight of what she had just survived pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, threatening to crush her. But as the Reaper's gaze bore into her, something shifted inside Apricot. She wasn't just a victim of these horrors. She had been given a gift, and with it, the power to fight back. The Reaper's words, meant to wound, instead sparked a fierce resolve deep within her. "I'll show you," Apricot whispered, her voice steady despite the fear still clinging to her. "I'll show you I'm not a disappointment." The Reaper lingered for a moment longer, its form flickering like a shadow at the edge of her vision before it vanished into the darkness. The warehouse returned to its mundane reality, voices, footsteps, the distant hum of machinery. But Apricot knew that nothing about her life would be ordinary ever again. The darkness that had been unleashed in her world was here to stay, and so was she.